Hi, this is Danielle, and I wrote my paper on determining the least restrictive environment for students with emotional behavior disorders and the ethical dilemmas following IDEA and LRE. So currently under IDEA, the least restrictive environment is defined as the requirement in federal law that students with disabilities receive their education to the maximum extent appropriate with non-disabled peers, and that special education students are not removed from regular classes unless, even with supplemental aids and services, education in regular classes cannot be achieved satisfactorily. My personal stance under IDEA and as an educational community, we do not have enough knowledge or criteria to determine the best LRE in order to educate EBD students. I currently work as a special ed teacher for the past 5 years on IEP teams, in which over half of our students have an EBD label, and I see firsthand all the time the struggle to trying to determine what's the best LRE for them for many different reasons. Next, I'm going to talk to you about the history on LRE for EBD students. There were 2 court cases that kind of led to the downfall of free and appropriate education for students with disabilities, one being public school Watson versus City of Cambridge in 1893, and then Department of Public Welfare versus Haas. And both of these cases basically stated the outcome was that students who the school felt would not benefit from education or who might take away education from other students were to be excluded. And then in react to that, there were 2 court cases that came about which eventually led to the rise of rights for students with disabilities. The first one in 1972 being the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1972. And this case stated that the state was delaying and hesitating to give the students a free education, and therefore that was violating their protection under the 14th Amendment law. And the second major case was Mills versus Board of Ed in 1972, which was brought about by families of 7 different children who were being excluded from school. They all presented with various disabilities such as behavior problems, hyperactivity, epilepsy, mental retardation, and physical impairments. They were representing over 18,000 students who were denied or excluded from public schools, and these 2 cases really got the ball rolling for laws to protect students with disabilities. So in 1975, they came up with the EAHCA, which stands for Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Which really started to give rights to students with disabilities. It mandated that qualified students with disabilities had the right to non-discriminatory testing, evaluations, a placement procedure, to be educated in the least restrictive environment, procedural due process, including parent involvement, a free education, and an appropriate education. In 1990, the EAHCA was renamed to Individuals with Disability for Education Act, also known as the IDEA. And then in 1997, there were significant amendments made in regards to progress for kids with EBD. Some of the amendments made, and the major one that really helps what was supposed to help determine LRE for kids with EBD, was that if a behavior of a student impacts his or her learning or the learning of classmates, then the team needs to conduct an FBA. However, it doesn't state in the law who has to conduct the FBA. And then from the FBA, it also says that while the law says the students need a free and appropriate placement, it does not say that it has to be the best placement for the child. So with determining LRE for EBD students, there are a lot of ethical dilemmas I personally feel are happening. First and foremost, having the student's best interests can become a dilemma when the team is taking into consideration what they feel is best for the school itself. So trying to balance between what the school already has to offer versus what the child actually needs. And they oftentimes try and tailor the IEP to fit both. And then the other part is oftentimes the professional conducting the FBA does not have the knowledge to properly conduct an FBA. I see this all the time in my school where the gen ed teacher and the special ed teacher who have no training really in writing an FBA are the ones that write the FBA, and then you don't actually have all of the data, knowledge, and information you need to write an effective BIP or to make a well-rounded ethical decision in regards to the LRE for a student with EBD. So when I started looking at research to try and support my topic, I often found research kind of trying to figure out the same thing as to what my conceptual paper was on. And the first study I found was a study that was conducted in 1994 in which they were trying to make a overarching scale for determining what least restrictive environment is. So they went and surveyed professionals in regards to what they felt was the most restrictive environment to the least restrictive environment. And from this, they developed the SARES, also known as the scale to assess restrictiveness on educational settings. This scale is great because it helps determine what is a least restrictive versus very restrictive environment. However, the flaw with this is that while we have this scale to determine what the restrictive environment is, we don't have a scale or criteria that determines what student or what a typical student would look like in this type of setting. So in 1998, there was a study completed in which they were trying to see how LRE decisions were made for 99 EBD students in the state of Iowa in both segregated behavior schools as well as general education schools. And they did this study through phone interview screenings as well as looking through permanent records, and the overall findings were that the teams looking at what programs are already offered rather than figuring out what the child really needs. So they were trying to really make it so that the kids were fitting the programs that they already had. And then the second major takeaway from their study was that in the IEP meetings there were limited presence of people. So there might have only been one teacher and one special ed teacher, no parents, no advocates, no one that really could sit down together as a whole team to really create an appropriate IEP for a student. So part of determining LRE for students with EBD students is having the whole team on board to really make a well-rounded decision. And in order to do that, there has to be a general education teacher on the team. And so this study looked at teachers' perception and knowledge on behavioral characteristics and strategies across educational placements. And basically what they did is they went in and they surveyed 36 different teachers in grades K through 12, both special education teachers and general education teachers, to really just get an idea of what their knowledge is, what they characterize as a quote-unquote behavior problem. And so in the end, their findings were that special education teachers would rate the characteristics as a bother and like more of an annoyance or nuisance, while the general education teacher would rate it as a serious behavior problem. So when it came to sitting down, there was no real guideline as to what was a serious behavior problem versus what was just an annoyance, and oftentimes this is where conflict arose when they were trying to create what would be the best LRE for students, because there was no criteria or guidelines that really defined what was considered a problem behavior. And then the last finding that they found, which is almost one of the overarching issues with LRE for EBD students, was that the gen ed teachers reported that they used strategies to help they knew strategies and were able to use strategies to help LD kids, but they did not have enough strategies to help the behavior kids. So in the end, we've made a lot of progress in educating EBD students in regards to their LRE and using the least restrictive interventions in place. We still need a lot more detailed explanation as to what an appropriate LRE should look like for EBD students, as well as some criteria for helping to determine and get everyone on the same page. The problem right now under IDEA is that while it states there should be a professional conducting an FBA, it's not explicit in stating that a BCBA needs to be conducting the FBA, so oftentimes the people that are conducting the FBA really don't have the knowledge or skills to be conducting it. And then if you don't have the all-around knowledge in order to determine what's best for the child, and not everyone that's sitting on the team has the knowledge, then you're never going to be able to get the best, least restrictive environment for that student. I suggest, and there are other organizations out there that suggest that in the next IDEA amendment that we should look more at the process of helping these students rather than just mandating laws that say give them the least restrictive environment. These laws are really great, but if we have no way to execute them, then they're almost null and void. Thanks.